This right here might just be one of the strangest video game consoles I have ever seen. At its core, this is actually a personal computer from the early 1980s, called the Sharp X1. But it's got some serious gaming chops too. And that's because it was made by the same company that gave us the X68000. But here's where things get a little interesting. Sharp had a pretty unique relationship with Nintendo, teaming up on oddball hardware like the Twin Famicom and the Sharp CRT TV with a built-in NES. What's also interesting is that some Nintendo titles were ported to the X1, something Nintendo nowadays would never do. But it didn't even stop there, because hidden inside is another surprise. It's also a PC engine, or TurboGrafx-16 as it was known in the US. That's right, one machine, two completely different gaming platforms. It's definitely one of the wildest mashups in retro video gaming history, so let's dive in and check it out. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today I'm really excited because we get to take a look at a pretty rare and incredibly interesting piece of Japanese gaming history. This is the X1 Twin, created and manufactured by then electronics giant Sharp Corporation. At its core, this is a Japanese computer, but it's also a video game console. And it's a fascinating piece of tech not just because of what it can do, but also the history behind it and all the different companies and partnerships that surround it. You see, back in the 80s, both Sharp and Nintendo had a rather deep working relationship. They've partnered on several projects, some I'm sure you're familiar with. The Twin Famicom, which is a Famicom and Famicom disk system all in one, the Sharp Nintendo Television, or Game Television as it was known in the US, as well as other oddities such as the Famicom Titler, a device for capturing high-quality Famicom gameplay footage, notable for its ability to generate RGB video internally. This relationship would even extend to future consoles such as the 3DS, which Sharp produced the LCD screens for. Anyway, back to the X1 Twin. These ran on a Zilog Z80, which is the same processor found in the Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear. The X1 computer commercially sold okay in Japan, but it couldn't quite compete with the PC-88 from NEC. That's Nippon Electric Company, the same folks who made the PC Engine, or TurboGrafx as it was known here in the US. But that's where things get even stranger. NEC, being a major competitor to Sharp, licensed the use of their PC Engine console to be integrated into the X1 Twin. And this is where I assume the twin part of the name comes from, the fact that it can play both X1 and PC Engine games on a single device. Much like the Twin Famicom, which could play regular Famicom games as well as Famicom Disk System games. And you'll even notice that the font for the word twin on both devices are the same. How curious. So when you fire up the X1, you're met with some text on screen. That's the operating system, called Hue Basic. As the name implies, it's a version of the BASIC programming language, but this one is developed by Hudson Soft, hence the Hue in front of BASIC, and this was meant for specifically X1 computers. Hudson Soft is a Japanese game developer known for titles like Bomberman, but they also co-developed the PC Engine with NEC. So you see, all these companies are in a way very much intertwined, which I find fascinating. Okay, but how does Nintendo fit into all this? Well, during the early days of the Famicom, Nintendo licensed some of their titles to be developed for other platforms. And yes, you guessed it, some of these were developed for the Sharp X1. Additionally, Nintendo released the Family Basic add-on for the Famicom, which was co-developed by none other than Hudson Soft and Sharp Corporation. So, in a nutshell, Sharp made the X1 Twin computer, which has a PC Engine built in from NEC, running an operating system developed by Hudson Soft, who co-developed the PC Engine with NEC, and also made licensed Nintendo games for the Sharp X1. Phew. Anyway, I don't think there's a device that better embodies this corporate love triangle, or should I say love square, better than the X1 Twin. It's wild and honestly makes this thing all the more fascinating. Anyway, let's take a closer look at the Sharp X1 Twin. But in order to do that, I need to install a few mods as well as address a few housekeeping things before we can use it and dive deeper into this crazy little box. So the first thing I'll be installing is a Gotek floppy drive emulator, much like an ODE or optical drive emulator, but for floppy disks instead of CDs. You see, X1 games were sold on these 5 1/4 floppy disks, kind of like this one here. They actually also came on cassette tapes, which is pretty crazy, but I don't have any of those to show you. The Gotek will be able to emulate these floppy disks so we can really explore the library of these crazy Nintendo titles developed for the X1. We'll also need a keyboard since the X1 won't function without one. I was able to pick this one up, but it's in pretty bad shape, so we'll give it a little TLC and get it working like new again. And speaking of TLC, the X1 Twin itself also needs a bit of a cleaning. But before we get into all that fun stuff, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Sendico. Sendico is an online service that helps you shop on Japanese websites and bid on Japanese auctions. They hold and consolidate all your orders in their warehouse until you want them shipped right to your door. They'll package them with care and ship all your orders in a single box directly to you. I personally use Sendico all the time and have always had a fantastic experience and found some killer deals on retro video game consoles. Deals like this Sharp X1 Twin that I'm able to show you today. Sendico gives you the ability to order from just about any online store in Japan. Check out the link in the description to get started with Sendico so you can find your very own retro gaming deals from Japan. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to work on restoring this Sharp X1 Twin. Okay, so the first thing I really want to do is tear down the X1 so that we can take a look at the internals and give it a deep clean. It was obviously pretty dirty and it had a bit of a musty smell like it's been stored in the basement for a while. So goal number 1 is to get it clean. The X1 Twin, being a larger device, is relatively easy to tear down with plenty of space to work with. Now this tiny board here is actually the PC engine, and it's surprisingly super clean. It also appears as though the capacitors have been replaced, and I do now recall the auction listing did say it was recently serviced, so that's great news and it's something that I won't need to address for a while. Anyway, with the computer completely apart, I got to scrubbing away the years of dirt and grime with some warm water, dish soap, and a toothbrush. I honestly find it extremely therapeutic giving these old consoles a little TLC and bringing them a bit closer to their former glory days. Anyway, with everything nice and clean, I set them aside to dry before we start the next step of reassembly. Now, as I'm putting everything back together, I can confirm that all the caps were indeed replaced, and that the previous owner actually did a pretty good job soldering in the new caps, so hats off to them. Alright, so once we get the 5 1/4 floppy drive installed, we need to change the jumper setting from 0, which makes it the primary drive, to 1, which changes it to secondary. We do this because we want the Gotek, which we're about to install, to be the primary drive. Next, we need to remove this cover plate from the front shell so we can slide in the Gotek. It's on there pretty tight, but we can carefully force it out. Apologies for my hand getting in the way of this shot. Anyway, once that's removed, we can start to prep the Gotek. The first thing we need to do is attach it to the 5 1/4 drive adapter. It's only secured with 4 screws. Then we need to make sure the jumper settings on this are also correct. You want this to set it as shown. This position is S0, which makes it the primary drive. And this jumper here you can just ignore as it's not connecting anything. Then we can go ahead and grab our Molex 2 4-pin connector and connect it to the Gotek. And then you'll need this male to female 34-pin extension cable and connect the female side to the Gotek, with the male side going to the 34-pin to shoe guard adapter. This is what's going to allow us to connect the Gotek to the Sharp X1. Great, now we just need to feed the Gotek into the open 5 1/4 bay and connect both to power and the shoe guard connector. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to mount the Gotek to secure it inside the drive bay, so I actually ended up using some zip ties to hold it in place. I did this a bit later off camera and it seems to have worked. Now all that's left to do is reassemble the X1 Twin. Now you will want to load the HCX firmware onto the Gotek. I'll leave a link to the website which tells you how to do this. Then you're going to want to adjust the emulator settings to this. I found that this configuration worked best at loading X1 games. Okay, now before we proceed, we will need to give a little TLC to the keyboard. I had to pick this up so we can actually use the X1 Twin, which won't operate without a keyboard. As you can see, the cable has completely disintegrated and needs to be replaced. So we'll go ahead and do that and also give this a deep clean as well. Yeah, the X1 keyboard cables are known to have this disintegration issue, but we'll get it working better than new. So first we'll tear it down. It's only held together with 6 screws. And this here is how the cable is connected to the keyboard, so we'll just go ahead and disconnect it. Now I'm actually planning to reuse this connector, so I'm just going to go ahead and snip it off here. To make sure I'm matching the wires correctly, I take note of which part of the headphone jack corresponds to each wire color using continuity on my multimeter. One should be for 5 volt, another for ground, and the last is for data transfer. So here you can see the diagram that I drew, which will help me when wiring in the new headphone jack. And this here is the little harness I made using that section of wire that I snipped off from the cable, and I already prepped each wire so we can go ahead and solder it to our new headphone jack. But before we continue, I need to clean my bench because all of that disintegrated wire material just got everywhere. Now I decided to also take this opportunity to give the keyboard a deep clean. And to start the process, I removed every single last key because they were pretty dirty. Just take a look at this one. It's a pretty good example of just how dirty these keycaps got. So with all the keys removed, we can head on over to the ultrasonic cleaner. I set it for about 10 minutes at the highest setting, which should be plenty of time to get rid of all that grime. Anyway, while that's going on, let's go ahead and wrap up the work on the new keyboard connector. So here, I'm mapping all the sections of the headphone jack to the appropriate pin on the new connector. And here I made another diagram so that I can make sure I wire the harness correctly. Then just make all the necessary connections, and here you can see that I'm using some heat shrink tubing to cover the solder joint and give an overall more professional look. Alright, now we can just feed the new harness through the existing hole in the lower keyboard shell and secure it with a locking nut. Fantastic, and here we have a nice headphone jack instead of a permanently attached cable, which I think makes the keyboard look a lot cleaner, and now we can more conveniently connect a cable only when we need to. Alright, so the keycaps should be done by now, so let's remove them from the ultrasonic cleaner and let them dry out. And once they are fully dry, we can go ahead and put them back on the keyboard. I did take a photo of the keyboard before removing all the keys so that I can remember how they all went back. Alright, things are looking pretty good. Now we just need to connect the other end of our harness to the keyboard and reassemble it. Now, one of the keys on the keyboard seemed to not be responsive, but thankfully Retro Renovo responded to my Twitter post and suggested using some Deoxit Fader F5, which ended up doing the trick. And there you have it, folks. Both the X1 Twin and keyboard are ready for some gaming. Man, I'm really loving how this thing turned out. While yes, it does have a few dings here and there, at least it is completely clean, both the X1 Twin and the keyboard. So with everything all set up, let's take a closer look at what this thing can do. To get started, we first need to connect the keyboard to the X1 Twin using a male-to-male TRS headphone cable thanks to our handy new mod for the keyboard. It's a pretty strange interface, but it does work just fine. Then we hit the orange power button and the computer comes to life. We're greeted with some text on screen, which reads, "Make ready any device." And we're prompted to either press F for floppy, R for ROM, or T for timer. Now before we dive into checking out some of the Nintendo games loaded on the GoTech, let me first show you how an actual game is loaded. So I have an original X1 title here called Wingman 2. It has a cool title, neat artwork, and it was made by Enix. You know, the company that merged with Squaresoft to become Square Enix. Anyway, all we need to do is insert the floppy into the X1, press the F button on the keyboard, and then press 1 for the secondary floppy drive. Remember, the GoTech is set to 0, which is the primary drive. And unfortunately, I get this screen, and no matter what button I press, the game won't respond. And this is where I realized I probably bought the worst game to demonstrate the X1 in action. after taking a look at the back of the game box and translating the Japanese, it appears as though the game requires an additional RAM module, which I don't have. So basically this means I really can't show you any gameplay footage, but the process I went through is basically how you would load a game from a floppy on the X1. Anyway, now let's take a look at the PC Engine functionality. To switch over to the PC Engine, I need to press this button labeled X1/Game. This toggles between the X1 and the PC Engine. Then I just insert my game of choice, can't go wrong with Splatterhouse, and then again power on the X1, and boom, we're launched right into the PC Engine. There is a single controller port to connect the PC Engine gamepad, and we're off to the races. Now what's funny is that when the X1 Twin is powered on, both the X1 side and the PC Engine side are running at the same time. See, I can switch between a X1 game and a PC Engine game. One could technically be playing both games at the same time. Now below the PC Engine controller port are two additional ports for X1 controllers. These are 9-pin ports very similar to those found on the Sega Genesis, but unfortunately have a different pinout and are incompatible with those controllers. Now, taking a look around back, we can check out the I/O, and interestingly enough, there's a port for RGB. This unfortunately is only for the X1 computer side and not for the PC Engine. I definitely plan on getting a RGB adapter cable so I can capture better footage of the X1. Now right below that is something called TV Control. X1 computers came with a dedicated monitor with a built-in TV tuner, thus these controls on the keyboard for changing the channel and adjusting the volume. It seems you could also add overlay effects superimposed on the TV video output. Not sure why you would want to do this, but it could be for video editing purposes. And below the TV controller port is the composite video and stereo audio RCA jacks, which output both the X1 and PC Engine video, and is obviously what I'm currently using. We also have a port for a printer, the AC power cable, as well as this chassis ground point labeled FG. Now, one last feature I want to dive into before we check out some interesting X1 games is, well, the overall aesthetics and design of the case. You see, the X1 Twin has some interesting design cues that look awfully familiar to the newer and more powerful Sharp X68000. We have the thin orange power button, the tiny volume dial, these little contours here in the front, and the X1 even has this almost dual tower design marked by the line that goes through the length of the entire face of the computer. Not as pronounced as the X68000, but I do think there is a similarity there. What do you think? The X1 Twin was the last revision of the X1 computer, and it was released in 1987, the same year the X68000 debuted as the successor. Alright, now let's take a look at a couple interesting titles for the X1, starting with what I think is the most interesting, and that's Super Mario Bros. Special. So to load it up, we'll turn the X1 on, and on the GoTech, I'll use the dial to scroll over to the Super Mario Bros. Game. Select it, and then on the keyboard press F for floppy, and then this time 0 since the GoTech is the primary drive. And after a few seconds, it loads right up. And here on the title screen, you can see both the Nintendo and Hudson Soft names, as this was developed by Hudson Soft and licensed by Nintendo. Now, upon an initial glance, it looks very much like an actual Super Mario Bros. Game for the NES. But once we start playing, yeah, a few slight differences start to emerge. The gameplay just feels super sluggish, and overall everything feels really slow. This is, in my opinion, virtually unplayable. And worst of all, the screen doesn't even scroll with Mario, but it does something akin to what we see from The Legend of Zelda on the NES, and the screen slides once you reach the end. And the controls are pretty awful too. X and Z are like your A and B buttons on the NES controller, and the numpad, specifically 2, 4, 6, and 8, are your direction buttons. It's super clunky and cumbersome, and I imagine one of the dedicated controllers for the X1 would make this a much more enjoyable experience. The sound, which I have coming through the internal speaker, sounds like a Mario game, although at some points it can sound pretty slow, especially when there are more than 2 sprites on screen. Anyway, while the look of the game does very much resemble the original NES version, the gameplay mechanics couldn't be any further, and honestly that's one of the defining traits of the original Mario game, its super tight controls. Now, Hudson Soft did develop some other Nintendo titles for the X1, such as Balloon Fight and Excite Bike. Unfortunately, I couldn't get Balloon Fight to work with the GoTech, and Excite Bike was actually only released on cassette, so it's basically incompatible with the GoTech as well. Anyway, one of the other games I tested that I found to be moderately playable was Gradius. I mean, you really can't mess Gradius up, although even this was tough to play using the keyboard. I really do need to get myself an actual controller. And of course, like I demonstrated before, this too can play Japanese PC Engine titles, and it does this flawlessly. This is certainly going to be the side of the X1 Twin that I'll be utilizing most. So in the end, what makes the Sharp X1 Twin, at least in my opinion, so interesting is the intersection of all these companies that surround the device. You have Sharp, NEC, Hudson Soft, and Nintendo all in one way or another tied to this machine. It's also probably one of the rarest revisions of the PC Engine, with the exception of the PC KD86 3G, which is a PC Engine built into a monitor. Anyway guys, there you have it. One of the absolutely strangest retro gaming consoles I've ever seen. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thank you to Sendico for making this video possible. Also, as an announcement, I do have a second channel and I just released another video for it, so you can check that out. I'll have a link down below in the video description. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.